Hello and welcome back to Arts of Hermes. This will be a relatively short video looking at a few groups of musical albums that are structured and arranged around particular sets of esoteric symbolic concepts. So I'm trying to get in the habit of doing a new video, or at least a part of a longer video every week, every Wednesday. As I mentioned at the end of the last video on surrealism, I've been working on a longer video on the artist and writer Leonora Carrington, but the first part of that was just not ready to go for this week, so I just thought we'd do this instead in the meantime. And then, hopefully the Carrington video, or the first part of the Carrington video, will be ready to go for next Wednesday. So let's see, no need to have seen any of the previous videos in this series. In the first video in the series called A Culture, introduced some of the overall themes and concepts that we're looking at over the course of this series, but definitely not necessary to have watched. So we're looking at esotericism in music today. Not the first time we've touched on this topic. The second video in the series, we looked at the musical group Coil, and it definitely won't be the last time either. Possibly the video to come after the Carrington video will be on Sun Ra, and there'll be others to come after that. But I thought it would be interesting today to look at, rather than focusing in on one particular creator, to look at a number of different albums from different artists and working across different musical genres who are not just doing albums on esoteric themes or with magical intentions, but specifically album structures, or in one case, a suite of compositions that are structured and arranged around particular esoteric concepts. So definitely not anything like a complete or historical, sort of overview of this concept within music. Just a handful of albums that I was already familiar with that I thought would kind of work together as an interesting exploration of some of these concepts in music. So I'm also limiting us here to three particular groups of symbolic cosmological symbols. So we'll be looking at the four elements, fire, water, air, and earth, the classical elements. And then from astrology, looking at the planets, and then also the 12 signs of the Zodiac. There's other things we could have included here. I'm familiar with a few albums that are structured around the tarot, like the major arcana of the tarot. Like there's that Walter Wegmüller album called Tarot. I think I'm aware of one or two others that have done the same thing. So there's certainly other esoteric album structures that we could have looked at. But yeah, just limiting us here because I think these three things, the elements, planets, and signs, are a nice, they themselves form a nice group as the main components of what we can refer to as the traditional Hermetic cosmology. We can definitely talk a lot more about esoteric cosmology and its transformation over time and its relationship to pre-modern cosmologies and a number of other, I think, interesting and important topics about the transformation and evolution of these cosmological structures and their understanding throughout the esoteric tradition. But that's something we can talk about in a lot more detail in a future series. All right, so just to get us sort of started off thinking about these ideas and thinking about them in relationship, I've got a woodcut from a 16th century work here, fairly well known. I'm sure some of you have seen this before. But arranged in, this is, of course, we're working with the pre-modern geocentric cosmology here for our structure. So arranged in a series of concentric circles here. So in the center, we have the earth divided into the four elemental realms, surrounded by the various celestial spheres. So in the earthly realm, we have split into the four elements. So in the very central circle, we see both earth and water. So we see the land masses of the earth as well as the oceans of the planet. In the circle surrounding that, we see the atmosphere. Of course, this is the element of air. And then surrounding that, we see a fiery sphere. This was a part of pre-modern cosmology is known as the Empyrean heaven, a sort of fiery region that was believed to be above the airy atmosphere. And then beyond the elemental realm, we have the celestial spheres, and we see here the 7 classical planets of the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And then beyond those, now this diagram is a bit more complicated, and we're not going to sort of worry about the specifics of that right here. But just for our purposes here, we can see beyond the sphere of Saturn, we have the 12 signs of the Zodiac. So that's what we'll be looking at our structuring our albums today. All right, so we'll start off with the 4 elements. So we're starting off in the center of our cosmological diagram, starting off on Earth, and then we will ascend the celestial spheres as we continue on with the video. All right, so I've just got 2 examples of albums that are structured around the 4 elements. So in both cases, these albums are made up of 4 tracks, each one named for and dedicated to an exploration of one of the 4 classical elements of fire, air, water, and earth. In both cases, these albums were originally released as vinyl LPs. And so because of just the nature and inherent, structure of the LP, right, you get 2, 22, 23-minute sides each. The albums are set up so that you get 2 elements on the A side and then 2 elements on the B side. But there's 24 different ways that this could be ordered, and of course you can also think about how the elements are grouped together, like which 2 elements go together on one side and then the other 2 elements together on the other side. So to get us thinking about the inherent relationships between the elements, we can look at them as structured by the pair of oppositions, so between hot and cold, and wet and dry. And each one of the 4 classical elements is a unique combination of one element each from these 2 dyads, these pairs of opposite qualities. So air is hot and wet, water is cold and wet, fire is hot and dry, and then earth is cold and dry. So this immediately gives us a structure and a relationship between the elements. So air sort of shares wetness with water and shares heat with fire, but doesn't share any of the qualities with earth. So we also get 2 sets of oppositions, 2 sets of opposite elements, where we have air and earth that don't share any qualities, and then fire and water, which are of course a very strong pair of opposites, and fire and water in particular often stand for other pairs of opposites, like the sun and the moon, that we see in a lot of alchemical and other esoteric works. So this is the second album from the British experimental musical collective Third Ear Band, which is a great name for a group, obviously playing on the idea of the third eye, right? So the third ear definitely announces their interest in esotericism and the consciousness altering or consciousness raising properties of music. They were formed in the late 1960s. Kind of rotating cast of musicians and somewhat varying instruments. Oboe is really prominent, as well as violin and cello, and a kind of assortment of different percussion instruments form the basis for a lot of their works. They're improvisational, exploring drone, although, you can hear, I think there's a kind of roots in a sort of really free jazz, improvisational approach, but not really rooted in jazz aesthetics, as just the instrumental lineup, I think, already suggests. So yes, this is their second album. Technically, the album is self-titled, but is often just referred to as Elements for an obvious reason. So on the A side, we get the air and earth tracks, and then on the B side, we get fire and water. So we can see here they're grouping them by the sets of oppositions. So we get on each side, we have two elements that don't share any of their qualities. So yeah, if you're listening to this album, I think you can really notice the way that the two tracks on each side really contrast with each other and are set off against each other. I particularly really like the B-side. I think the fire track is probably my favorite on this album, although the water is quite nice as well. I noticed in some digital, on some streaming services, at least for there's an expanded and remastered version of this album available. The titles of the fire and water track are reversed. But it'll be quite obvious. I think if you listen to it, the water track actually starts off with a recording of some water flowing, so it'll be pretty obvious. But the water, you can also just look at the timestamps there as well. But yeah, I think really interesting album, and I think they do a really nice job of capturing the qualities of the elements and really invoking them and bringing them forth through the improvisations. So yeah, definitely I think that's the thing to really listen to as you're listening to the albums, and especially looking at how they're, I think because of the way they're arranged into these pairs of opposite elements, you're really looking at the different qualities and the way those are being expressed through the sounds that we're hearing. And then just as a side note, there's some other definitely esoteric works and themes from Third Ear Band. This is their first album, Alchemy, which in its title, we have an image of an alchemical woodcut on the front cover, and then even some of the track titles, Druid One, Stone Circle, Egyptian Book of the Dead, definitely announcing their esoteric interests there as well. And I actually like this album and listen to it more often than I listen to the Alamus album. So yeah, not directly related to what we're talking about today, but just wanted to mention that as another thing that's definitely worth listening to from them. All right, and then our second example of an album structured around the four elements is from a jazz group led by Joe Henderson and featuring Alice Coltrane, who plays both keyboard and harp here on this recording. Interesting lineup. We got sort of Henderson on sax, we got Charlie Hayden on bass, also featuring violin and a few other percussion instruments besides the kit player. We got tablas and some other percussion on a few of the tracks too. So I think a really nice example of sort of 1970s jazz, incorporating Indian and other sort of diverse influences into the music. Also using the recording studio, there's some overdubbing, and we also got some studio effects as well, including some really nice use of delay on Henderson's sax on a few of the tracks. Let's see. In my head, I think I tend to kind of think of this as an Alice Coltrane album, and that's certainly, I don't know Henderson's work particularly well. I definitely came to it through listening to Alice Coltrane, who I think has a very powerful spiritual element and a mystical element in a lot of her recordings. She herself, I think, had a very intense spiritual path that I think if you're interested in her spirituality, which is pretty extreme and quite dark at times, there's a great book by Jana Brown called Black Utopia, or Utopias, I think it's plural. But yeah, by Jana Brown, who has a nice chapter on Coltrane's spirituality and spiritual life and that reflection in her music. But anyways, so on this album, we have, again, two elements on each side of the vinyl, but arranged differently here. So on the A side, we have the two hot elements of fire and air, and on the B side, the two cold elements of water and earth. So here, we get a real distinction between the A side and the B side, a much more intense A side, and then a calmer sort of feeling from the B side of the record. So yeah, definitely giving a different kind of structure and feeling to the third ear band example. But again, I think they just do a really fantastic job of really embodying the feeling and the quality of the elements throughout here. Yeah, so really, really great album. Definitely very highly recommended. Right, so continuing on, we will leave the Earth, leaving the realm of the four elements, and move into the realm of the planets. So I actually don't have an example of an album that uses a particularly coherent planetary set of the planets, and I think part of the reason is that how many planets there are exactly has been a little bit open to question in modern esotericism. We have the 7 classical planets, which is what we see in this the 16th century cosmology in the diagram here. So the 7 classical or visible planets of the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. But then we also have the modern planets of Uranus, Neptune, and then throughout a lot of the 20th century, Pluto was also considered to be one of the planets. And we also have the moon and the sun. We no longer think of as planets, and I think that has some influence on that shifting sense of there being a really coherent set of elements here. But yeah, let's just look at, I've just got 2 examples of the planets in music, though unlike with the elements, we'll have different arrangements here and neither a complete set exactly. All right, so our first example of the planets in music is not actually an album, but a suite of compositions. However, I think given the number of compositions, their overall length, and the fact that it is, I think almost certainly most often experienced as a recording, makes it basically or roughly equivalent in format to an album and fit well enough with the other albums that we're talking about here in this video. So the most famous work that we're talking about here, as well as the earliest as well, composed between 1914 and 1917. This is The Planets by Gustav Holst. So we've got 7 compositions in total here, which we might expect to be attributed to or arranged according to the 7 classical planets, but Holst has not included the Sun and Moon, but has included Uranus and Neptune. Now, Pluto wasn't discovered until 1930, so Holst is simply unaware of Pluto. He's not making any intentional decision to not include Pluto in the work. However, there have been several composers who have composed a work for Pluto as an 8th composition or a sort of addendum to be included in performances of this work. So, to be honest, I really don't care for these works. They really don't appeal to me musically, and I also think that speaking, astrologically or esoterically, I think they really don't do a good job of evoking the nature of these planets, which I think the responsibility for that at least partially lies with Holst's sources. Although Holst studied astrology pretty devotedly and reportedly became fairly adept at reading horoscopes, he's really relying on the early modern, or not early modern, but the earlier proponents of modern astrology, in particular Alan Leo, who's really the instigator of modern astrology, who have their own takes and interpretations on the planets that in a lot of ways diverge from traditional understandings of them, very influenced by theosophy and some very other modern ideas that I think introduce some real distortions into the understanding of the planets and the practice of astrology. And although I don't particularly like these works, and I don't think they do a great job of evoking the nature of the planets. They are, I think, in a way interesting to listen to, just to hear the way that Holst's conception of the planets and that particular modern tradition that he's working within, the way that that's expressed musically. I think that itself can become an interesting exercise. But yeah, I guess that's all I'll say about that. And then our second example of the planets in music is from an album that I like quite a bit more. This is Interstellar Space from John Coltrane. So we have 4 improvised compositions here that are simply made up of the duo of Coltrane on tenor sax and Rashid Ali on drums. So these are quite late recordings from Coltrane. This recording session was from February of 1967, and then Coltrane died in July of that same year, and then the album wasn't released until 1974. Now, after Coltrane's death, his wife, Alice Coltrane, who of course we just mentioned from the album that she did with Joe Henderson, The Elements that we just talked about, she was really responsible for going through his unreleased recordings and packaging them and releasing them, and also often titling the works as well. So despite the fact that John Coltrane himself didn't actually give these compositions these titles, and I think there's no reason to think that he specifically intended these compositions to be expressive of these particular planets, nevertheless, I think they definitely are expressive of his interests and the focus of his music in the latter years of his life. He and Alice together really explored astrology and other esoteric systems and religions and philosophies, and that, I think, deep mystical influence and intention was really expressed throughout all of his later music here. So even if he didn't specifically think of these as planetary or astrological works, they are nevertheless expressive of his interests and his general musical intentions in the latter years of his life, for sure. Also, I think that even though they weren't intended as expressive of these particular planets, I think she did a really great job of choosing the titles for each one. I think it's really possible to hear in the compositions how they might correspond to the planets. So I think it's a really great selection of titles, and choosing which track to attribute it to which planet. I think she did a really, really fantastic job there. I think it's also just interesting to look at the 4. Of course, we've only got 4 out of the planets chosen here, but there's a real, I think, logic to the particular planets and the way that they're grouped together. So we have, on each side of the vinyl, we have 2 planets that are a real classical pair. So we have Mars and Venus on the A side, and then Jupiter and Saturn on the B side, which are very traditional sort of pairs of opposite but complementary planets. I don't know that Alice was specifically thinking of this, but I think it's also quite interesting to recognize that these 4 planets can also correspond, sort of indirectly with the 4 elements. More specifically, they correspond with the 4 classical temperaments. So Mars would correspond with the choleric temperament, which is hot and dry, just like fire. Venus would correspond with the phlegmatic temperament, which is cold and wet, just like water. So another way of thinking about the opposition between Mars and Venus is that, like fire and water, they don't share any of those qualities in common. And then similarly with Jupiter and Saturn, Jupiter is attributed to has the sanguine temperament, which is hot and wet, like air is. And then Saturn is cold and dry, which is the melancholic temperament. And of course, the element of Earth is also cold and dry. So I think there's a real sort of sensitivity and awareness of of astrology and its concepts and the relationships between the planets here on this album. which, yeah, like I said, is a really great album. I think it's a really great example of Coltrane's later work. Your enjoyment of it may be relevant to your level of appreciation of free jazz. Definitely not the easiest of John Coltrane's works to get into, but yeah, I really like it a lot. All right, and then finally we get to the outer reaches of our cosmology with the signs of the zodiac. Now, unlike with the planets, where there was some uncertainty or some question about how many of them exactly there are, we now are back in having a definite and secure sense of a coherent set. So we have the 12 signs of the zodiac. Now, I think the thing to be aware of with any of the, either music attributed to the signs of the zodiac or any other kind of work of art, or even really in any modern work of esotericism, you always want to have this question about which system of rulerships we're using, because which planet rules which sign really influences the nature of that sign. So that's something you'll definitely want to listen to whenever you're listening to these albums. So in the chart there, we've got the signs of the zodiac listed out on the left. In the middle column, we have the traditional planetary ruler of each one of the signs, which, that's the system that I use and that I definitely favor. And that's something we can definitely talk about in future videos on astrology, about why they were changed and what that means and the significance and implications of it. Even if I don't like them, I think they're still interesting to talk about. And it's, I think, also interesting to listen for, and an interesting exercise in listening to, like when you're listening to a composition attributed to Aquarius, I think you'll want to be asking, are we getting the Saturnian Aquarius or the Uranian Aquarius? Because those are quite different. There's things that both the modern and traditional versions of Aquarius will have in common, but they will also feel quite different. And so, even if you're listening to a composition that's using the version of Aquarius that you yourself don't practice with or favor, it's still an interesting exercise and valuable for that reason. So in particular, when we're listening to a composition attributed to Scorpio, we'll want to ask, is this the Mars-ruled Scorpio or the Pluto-ruled Scorpio? And then with Pisces also, is this the Jupiterian version of Pisces or the Neptunian Pisces? It might be worth being aware that in some versions of modern astrology, this was particularly prominent in the 1970s. There was the idea that Pluto was sometimes considered to be the ruler of the sign Aries, and that's something we can definitely talk about why that happened and why that was abandoned as well in a future video. I don't think there's any examples here that we're going to talk about, but yeah, just something to be aware of as you're listening to these things. All right, our first example, and also definitely my favorite example of a zodiacal album or suite of compositions. This is from Mary Lou Williams, the jazz pianist, from her Zodiac suite, which I just learned actually exists. I only know the one version of the recordings, but actually exists in several different versions with even different sort of instrumentations. And apparently in some of those other versions of the suite, she actually chose musicians to play on the different individual compositions based on their own astrological charts, which I think that itself is a really interesting way of approaching making a suite of works, of actually choosing the individual people to perform on it, who will be best able to embody or express just through their own personal nature the intended energy or concept or symbol for that particular composition. Let's see. So arrangement here is just in the sort of logical, straightforward order. Starting with Aries and just going through the 12 signs. On the record, we get the first 6 signs on the A side and the second 6 on the B side. So at least relatively short versions of these compositions here on the at least the versions that were released on the album. I think they're great compositions. They're also, she's a jazz pianist, but also a lot of influence from modern classical composition as well, which is really interesting to listen to. And I think she does a really good job of expressing the nature of each one of the signs, and in particular, I think it's really noteworthy the way that she avoids making like really obvious choices. Like it would be just really easy. Okay, Aries is going to be fast and loud, right? I mean, that's just an incredibly obvious way of doing an Aries-based sort of composition. But I think in so many cases she really avoids that. But through I don't have the musical vocabulary or education to really say exactly the choices that she's making, but through the chord progressions and harmonic choices, I think she really expresses the nature of each one of the signs, but in a really non-obvious way, which I think really invites a deeper sort of mode of listening, because they're not always going to be what you would necessarily expect, but nevertheless I think do a really great job of capturing the sort of energy or atmosphere of each one of the 12 signs. So definitely highly recommended listen here. All right, and then a very different sort of album that I really actually don't care for. This is Love, Sex, and the Zodiac. What we have here are 13 pieces in an introduction, followed by one piece for each sign of the zodiac that are written or they're essentially spoken word pieces written and performed by Rick Holmes with accompaniment from a jazz group led by Cannonball Adderley. So in each one of these works, Holmes, or the sort of male narrator, is talking to a woman who, these are obviously geared towards like sun sign astrology. So for Aries, he's like talking to a woman who has the sun in Aries. So this is definitely falling into that sort of 12-fold typology thing where you get like basically 12 types of people, which is a way of doing astrology that I'm really not a fan of. And this is made sort of even sort of worse by the fact that you get a male speaker, obviously like addressing a woman, who has the sun in each one of these signs, and he's really, in a very seductive sort of tone, is really telling her about herself and about her sexuality, like telling her about her sexuality and what she wants and what she needs, which is just pretty gross. Maybe sort of interesting, worth noting, is the album cover here, where we get a version of the Zodiac Man, which we see in a lot of medieval and Renaissance era astrological texts, where you get the 12 regions of the body, starting with the head and moving down to the feet, attributed to each one of the signs of the zodiac. Though obviously this is we get a nude woman here instead of the traditional Zodiac Man. All right, then we have a closely related, but also somewhat different work. So again, with spoken word by performance by Rick Holmes. Now, accompanied rather than by a jazz group led by Cannonball Adderley, this is a group led by his younger brother, Nat Adderley, and his sextet. So here in this work, I think, definitely not a favorite of mine, but I definitely prefer it to the previous album that we talked about. And I think it's got a few things going for it that are a lot better. I mean, first of all, I think just musically, the compositions are longer. This was actually originally released as a double LP, so we get longer compositions for each of the signs that are less dominated by the spoken word. There's more just instrumental sections, which I think makes it more musically interesting. And the narration here drops that element of being a male narrator, sort of seducing a woman and telling her, about her sexuality. And here we just get a more general, broad description of each one of the 12 signs. I think this is definitely again, not a favorite, but interesting to listen to, and interesting to listen to the way that the group is expressing the nature of the signs, and the narration, the verbal description of each one of the signs is a sort of decent example of definitely a very modern version of the signs of the zodiac. Again, geared towards the sort of sun sign astrology. So we're talking about the sun in each one of the signs. And yeah, we definitely get that sort of modern rulership. But yeah, definitely more interesting than the previous album there. All right, and then the final work that we'll talk about in this video is it's a sort of suite of melodies that exist in various sort of formats or presentations, often packaged together and released as an album. We can talk about that in a minute. So this is a suite of melodies from the pioneering electronic composer Karlheinz Stockhausen. This is Tierkreis, which means zodiac in German. This is definitely not the only example of esoteric or mystical themes in Stockhausen's work. Stockhausen himself had a really lifelong and abiding interest in esoteric, mystical, and theosophical works and ideas. And in particular, Stockhausen came to feel that he himself had... In his previous incarnation, he had lived on a planet orbiting the star Sirius, which was a much more spiritually advanced civilization, and that he had been sent here to Earth as a kind of messenger through his music to assist in the evolution and development of the human species and human civilization. So he really took a lot of these ideas very, very personally, and they really came to inform his entire project and his sense of his purpose and mission in life. Stockhausen's a really interesting figure. He's certainly extremely important. One of, if not the most important pioneer of electronic music. Maybe we could talk about him more in some sort of future video. But for today, we'll just talk about this one work. So again, we've got 12 works, each attributed to one of the signs of the zodiac. And let's see, I'll just read. This is an excerpt I've got here from the liner notes to the album. Let's just read through it. In 1975, 12 melodies were composed for the work Music in the Belly for 6 percussionists and music boxes, one for each sign of the zodiac. So although they were originally composed for percussion and these like custom-made music boxes, the performances of them are generally not with that particular set of instruments. That was just the original basis for their composition. But they can be performed by different sets of instruments, as the liner notes go to detail after what we're going to read here. But then Stockhausen himself said about this, I began to busy myself with the 12 human characters of the zodiac, of which I had until then only a vague idea. In inventing each melody, I thought of the characters of children, friends, and acquaintances who were born under the various star signs, and I studied the human types of the star signs more thoroughly. Each melody is now composed with all its measures and proportions in keeping with the characteristics of its respective star sign, and one will discover many legitimacies when one hears a melody often and exactly contemplates its construction. Each melody is composed in such a way that one should play it at least 3 times. When one wishes to listen to several of them one after another, then one should be played 3 or 4 times in succession. So the liner notes, beyond the point that we're going to read here, go on to detail a lot of the specifics of their construction. They are, at least broadly, kind of serialist compositions, following, I don't know how exactly, but following at least broadly sort of serialist compositional principles, which is where Stockhausen really had his own musical roots. The liner notes go on and say, each of the melodies, therefore, has its own character with its own central pitch. Aquarius, the star sign of Ulrika Stockhausen's youngest daughter, to whom he dedicated music in Bach, is the first melody, and E flat is its central pitch. E is the central pitch of Pisces, etc., chromatically upward. So each work has its, I think Stockhausen's really taking advantage of the fact that there are 12, musical pitches, and then attributing, each sign of the zodiac in order to one of the 12 musical pitches, which is also, I think, a nice way of, thinking about the way of relating, music to an esoteric system. Here, it's being directly related to music theory and composition. Stockhausen may have been aware of this, but classically, 7 of the modes, of like pre-modern Western music, 7 of the modes were attributed to the 7 planets, and then the 8th mode, at least within the sort of common practice of like the European or the church. The 8th mode was attributed to the fixed stars, or to the zodiac. So, he's not sort of following those traditional attributions, but in a way he's thinking about them along the same lines of traditional thinking about the relationship between musical theory and astrology. Let's see. Anyways, he says, let's see. So, Aquarius is the first melody, and E flat is its central pitch. E is a central pitch of Pisces, etc., chromatically upward. Leo is they just go in order of the zodiac, but just starting, non-traditionally with Aquarius, but just for the personal reason, because that was his daughter's sun sign. Leo is the middle pitch, and its central pitch is A, and finally Capricorn's central pitch is D. So yeah, there's a lot of different recordings of this work available, and it's interesting to listen to it because of the sort of variable nature and variable instrumentation with the works. It's interesting to listen to a few different recordings and compare them. If you know more about music than I do, you might also be interested to read through the rest of the liner notes. They're really easy to find online. It goes into a lot of the details of the specific musical parameters and compositional ideas in each one of the works, as is sort of typical with Stockhausen. They have very intellectual and very, very detailed compositional principles for each one of the works. All right, so just a couple final thoughts to wrap us up here. Let's see. First of all, I just wanted to emphasize again something we've already touched on a bit, but the inherently relational nature of each one of these sets of esoteric principles or symbols or concepts, personas, however we want to think about them and approach them. But yeah, I think it's just worth appreciating how they are as much a set or a structure of relationships as much as a set of just individual principles, each with their own just sort of self-consistent, self-existing nature, but the way that they relate to each other, and approaching, these albums or these works or any other similar things that you might be familiar with or that you might discover. And of course, this could extend out beyond music as well to any other, art form or form of creative activity or production that's structured around similar lines. But thinking about them again, the relationships between the individual compositions, how for example on one of the albums attributed to the elements, maybe just listening to one of the tracks on its own might not, we might not be entirely sure which element we're listening to. But if we listen to the entire, set of tracks and think about the tracks or the compositions in relationship to each other, then it might be really obvious. If we hear the fire and water tracks next to each other, it might be really obvious, the difference between them. And that is, at least as important as the way that each individual track expresses, that particular element. So yeah, just emphasizing that relational nature, which of course we could also extend out beyond the specific groupings that we've looked at here. We could even think about the relationship between, say the element of fire and the 3 fire signs of the zodiac, right? So looking at Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius, or the compositions attributed to those 3 signs, on a particular album, and how those 3 things express something, similar to what's expressed on a track attributed to the element of fire on a different work. Because that's something we can definitely explore in future videos. The inherent relationships, both within the groups and between the groups of principles as well, and that understanding all of those sets of relationships is really, I think, the core of learning these esoteric, symbolic languages and cosmologies and systems. Anyways, there's so much more to say about that here, but maybe we'll just leave it there for now. But yeah, maybe just something to keep in mind as you're listening to some of this stuff. And then finally, I just want to suggest that I think it's really worth spending some time reflecting on the particular type of thinking that we have to do, or that we are drawn into doing when we engage with these works or any similar sorts of works, and especially if we engage with them in a critical fashion. I think they really require us to think in terms of analogy, and that is exactly the type of thinking that is so important in all of the practice of any of the esoteric arts, or in understanding esoteric philosophy or cosmology, or even appreciating esoteric works of art. We have to be able to think in terms of analogy and relationship, and the ability to cross from seemingly very disparate domains of experience or reality, and to see those types of relationships. And I think that engaging with these sorts of works, it can be a really great exercise in learning to do that, which is something I know I've mentioned in some of the previous videos in this series, and I'm sure we'll talk about again. But yeah, I just think it's worth thinking about that a bit, and appreciating what you're doing when you think, what would, not just what does a particular sign of the zodiac mean when you're reading a birth chart, but also what would that sign of the zodiac sound like as an instrumental musical composition, or listening to a composition and thinking, how does this really express anything true, about this particular planet that it's attributed to, and why does it do that, and how does it do that, and how do I evaluate that, and how do I engage with that? I think thinking about all of those sorts of things and thinking along those lines is, I think, one thing that can be extremely valuable about esoteric arts for people engaged in studying and learning these things, as I'm sure many of the people listening to this are. Anyways, as always, there's so much more we could talk about all of these things, but just wrap it up here. So thanks for watching. I hope this has been interesting and useful. As always, you can subscribe if you want to share my work. You can check out the links below. And I'll be back next Wednesday, hopefully with the first part of the promised video on Leonora Carrington's works. So until then, take care. Bye. Thanks for watching.